recovery since at least World War II. And the 8 years before the financial crisis weren't so hot either. Growth averaged just half of what it did from the end of World War II through 2000. Or to put it another way, during the 80s and 90s, there were 35 quarterly periods when the economy grew at least 4% on an annualized basis. Since then, just 8. Like an aging pitcher and his fastball, the U.S. economy is hitting top speed with decreasing frequency. And if you listen to various economic forecasts, CBO, the Fed, this sort of slow growth is here to stay. Superficially, the reasons behind the slowdown are straightforward. U.S. growth, adjusted for inflation, has averaged 3.3% over the past 5 decades. Of that growth, roughly half has come from the growing labor force and half from increased productivity. But the old math is giving way to the new math. We have a much slower growing labor force, and because of that, we're going to have to grow productivity a lot faster if we're going to grow just as fast in the future as we have in the past, much faster growth of 4 or 5%. Unfortunately, we're seeing just the opposite. After surging through the mid-1990s to the mid-2000s, productivity growth has decelerated annually since 2005 and has been much, much worse during this recovery and expansion, averaging about 0.5%. So you take the population hitting retirement age and growing more slowly is why a recent analysis from the San Francisco Fed finds real growth is likely to be well below historic norms, maybe just 1.5%, 1.75% per year, with per capita growth of just 0.9%. That's about half of, again, what it's been for the past century. So we're talking about a major permanent deceleration. Okay, so what's going wrong with the American growth machine? Is it the Obama administration economic policies? Is it just the hangover from the Great Recession and financial crisis? I think one problem with those explanations, telling the whole story, is that the economy's troubles preceded the Obama presidency and the Great Recession, and the slowdown, particularly in productivity growth, is a global phenomenon. I think a better explanation is that the U.S. economy suffered a very bad, damaging recession of the sort often associated with weak recoveries. But then that's been superimposed on top of a sharply slowing longer-term trend. So the worst of both worlds, in other words. So we have weak labor force growth, lower labor force participation, and weak productivity. And as the Woody Allen quote remarked, these problems have been a long time in coming. But the problem isn't just slow growth, and Republicans, conservatives, economists love to talk about growth. It's that the growth has been lopsided. Even a passing glance at the business news headlines, you can find all sorts of stories about American innovation, Google, new startups, Uber, but the dynamic parts of the American economy seem to be becoming more concentrated in a smaller and smaller number of high-performing regions. In near 20 counties, accounting for just 17% of the U.S. population, were responsible for half of the net new increase in small businesses from 2010 to 2014. Moreover, the largest counties produced more than twice as many jobs during the 2010s recovery as they did during past recoveries. So we have the most populous counties becoming very fast growing. So I think the challenge for policymakers is to find policies to make sure the U.S. economy grows as fast in the future as it has in the past, and that the fruits of that growth aren't just in New York, Boston, and Silicon Valley. And one other thing I want to briefly mention, I think perhaps the greatest challenge for workers going forward is not trade or the dislocation from trade. Rather, the focus on reworking old trade deals, I think, is a huge distraction. We need to really think about the challenges of automation going forward. There are a lot of forecasts about how many jobs the robots are going to take. But regardless, I think it's safe to say that smart robots and software will do more and more of the jobs that we do, or at least parts of the jobs that we do. And we have to make sure our workers are prepared to do those other parts of the job, maybe the more creative parts, design parts, and that's what we need to focus on. Make sure we have a high innovation, high wage economy, where technological advances create all sorts of new jobs and industries. And we have to make sure the workforce ready to fill those jobs and a modernized safety net for when they aren't ready to fill those jobs. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pethokoukis. And next up would recognize the mayor of LaPorte, Bar Milo.
Thank Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and esteemed members of the committee. I'm honored to join you to discuss both the challenges, but more importantly, the opportunities for improving the lives of the American worker. I have the privilege of serving as mayor of the city of LaPorte, Indiana, also known as the hub of awesome. LaPorte is a city of just over 22,000, where safeguarding equal access to the American dream for all is a primary mission. This mission requires boldly innovating in a landscape where too many Americans, particularly those in the manufacturing arena, feel like our best days are behind us. For many individuals, access to jobs feels limited, wages seem stagnant, and a nationwide opioid crisis is devastating families. On the flip side of the same coin is the perspective that I consistently receive when visiting with employers across the state. Almost every single one shares their primary challenge being one of needed employees. I have jobs, the CEO will say, but I can't find people to fill them. When questioned why, he or she will respond, I need someone with the right general skills who will routinely show up to work and pass a drug test. To reconcile these seeming disjointed perspectives, I'd like to highlight 3 solution areas by sharing some short first-hand experiences. First, globalization and automation are offering more Americans access to higher-paying jobs, but they need the right education and training. Since 2012, LaPorte has celebrated over $250 million in new capital investment and almost 1,100 new positions. 80% of that $250 million in new investment came from manufacturing industries participating in the global marketplace. Almost all of the new positions created in these industries were in areas of advanced manufacturing. When one visits these plants, they look like a futuristic NASA project with the abundance of carefully choreographed robots. One plant is even considered the most advanced aerospace manufacturing facility in the world. Many are exceeding their global market projections, but are most challenged by the need to hire individuals with the skills to operate the many technology-based elements of their process. As such, the growth in jobs from global corporations are not only creating new job opportunities, but positions with high wages due to the increasing demand for skilled employees. Second, empowering current and future workers means individualizing education and training pipelines to address demand, interests, and skill sets. To best display this, I'd like to share the story of Anjay Nelson. Anjay graduated high school early and was following what she thought was the course she was supposed to take by pursuing a 4-year business degree. To afford tuition, though, she was working 2 jobs and was unable to put the attention to her schoolwork she needed. Before long, she was in debt with few credits to her name because she couldn't get passing grades. She stopped taking courses while continuing to work and went to one of Indiana's employment offices known as Work One. There she met with a counselor who walked her through the Indiana Career Explorer web portal, which helps job seekers match interests and skill sets with career areas. Through this and a conversation with her sister who worked at a local factory, Anjay found that manufacturing seemed more in line with her interests. The Work One counselor was then able to connect Anjay with a new certified production technician course taught by Ivy Tech Community College. The course was initiated by a partnership of the City of LaPorte, LaPorte Urban Enterprise Association, Ivy Tech, and industry partners 2 years previous, and offered a scholarship for motivated students like Anjay. Through the course, Anjay was thrilled to discover she loved learning about reading blueprints, understanding manufacturing terminology, and many other topics. Shortly after graduating, she found a position at CVG Sprague, where she now works making a variety of windshield wipers. She couldn't be happier because she's fascinated by the work, earns good wages with a manageable schedule, and is now able to pursue specific career goals at a pace she can balance with changes in financial and family availability. Education and training tracks like this reduce student debt, help employees and employers find success, and encourage a path of consistent learning, which is necessary as technology continues to change in the field of manufacturing. And finally, programs aimed at attacking the opioid crisis must see each person as an asset to be cultivated. It's easy to feel overwhelmed and disheartened when discussing the opioid crisis. Amidst this nightmare, though, are oases of hope among those who can connect with the kind of support that is equipping them with the skills they've not been exposed to. For many, the skills to plan, budget, process emotion, resolve conflict, maintain employment are skills that they've not been exposed to. This is best portrayed through the stories of a group of women I recently talked with at the Worthy Women Recovery Home, a home for women transitioning back into society after serving jail sentences for drug offenses. Each of the women I spoke to were at least second or third generation substance abusers, where drug use was more common than Sesame Street while growing up. What's helping these brave women see success is being in an environment of positive development and accountability at the home, as well as participating in an employment program through Goodwill Industries. Through this program, a representative serves as an intermediary between employers and the employees, ensuring accountability and skills development in the aforementioned gap areas. As the women progress, longer-term life and career goals are identified, as well as the paths toward accomplishment. When asked what they wish policymakers and others could understand about creating paths to success, one woman shared, "I wish they could see me for who I am now and who I can be, not just who I was before." There is exciting opportunity ahead for Americans if we continue adapting our education pipelines to empower workers with both life and technical skills to thrive in the dynamic global marketplace. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor. Would now like to recognize Mr. Friedman, Dr. Friedman, for his testimony.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members, for the opportunity to speak with you today about what I think is a very important issue. I'm an economist, and along with Raj Chetty and Nathan Hendren, I direct something called the Equality of Opportunity Project, where we use big data to understand the pathways to opportunity. I'd like to take my time today to share several figures with you from our work that I think highlights the challenges we face as a nation, but I hope also points to potential solutions. So as I think a number of people have already referenced, there's perhaps no more shared tenet across all individuals than the belief that each child, through hard work, should have the opportunity to grow up and earn more and have a better standard of living than his or her parents. And so what we did is we used data on this figure right here to calculate for kids born in each year over about the past half century, what fraction of them do in fact grow up to earn more than their parents did at a similar age. And what we find is that in 1940, kids born in 1940, 90% of them grew up to earn more than their parents. But as you see from the figure, this has fallen quite sharply over the past half century, so that kids born in my own cohort in 1980 have no better than 50-50 odds of doing so. And what we find is that it's a combination of both the lack of recent growth, but also the rather unequal distribution of that growth across society that caused this decline. Now, while children today face greater challenges on average, what we also see is that there's incredible variation in opportunity across the United States. So to look at this, we calculated the fraction of children from poor families, and we've defined that as having incomes in the bottom fifth of the income distribution, who grew up themselves to earn in the top fifth of the income distribution. And we calculated this measure of upward mobility for poor kids for each city in the country. And we can put it on a map here, and the lighter areas imply more upward mobility. And so what we see is that there's just an incredible amount of variation. So it's as low as 4% of poor kids have this degree of success in some places like Atlanta and Charlotte, and it's up as high as 17% in other areas of the country. Now, a 17% success rate might not seem that high, but recall that we are measuring success as getting into the top 20% of the income distribution, right? So only 20% of kids can get into the top 20% of the income distribution, and so if 17% of poor kids are doing so, that basically means that there's essentially equal opportunity for kids no matter their background. Now, this map highlights the regional variation in the U.S., but there's a great deal of local variation as well. And so to show you this, I'm going to zoom in around Washington, D.C. So there's an average upward mobility rate of 11%, and here we've done the same thing for all the counties in the D.C. area. And what you see here is there's this great deal of variation locally as well, right? You don't have to go all the way across the country to find high opportunity areas. We see, for instance, the district itself has relatively low mobility at just under 5%, but just across the river in Fairfax County, it's more than 3 times higher. And so I think what this shows is, while insufficient upward mobility is a national problem, the fact that it varies greatly means that we need local as well as national policy solutions. Now, of course, it's worrying to one perspective that opportunity is not equally distributed across the United States. This variation means, though, that there are great examples of high opportunity areas in our country that we can study and learn from, and then perhaps apply these lessons to improve prospects in lower mobility areas. And so we looked at how do high mobility areas differ on average from low mobility areas. And what we find is 2 things jump out of the data that I think align with many of the things we've already heard. So the first thing is that high mobility areas exhibit a very high degree of community connectedness in a particular community fabric. So quantitatively, we measure that as less residential segregation, for instance, by income, as higher levels of social capital, and as lower instances of single-parent households. And I think what's important to recognize here is this is not just the direct effect of a single parent making things worse for their own kid. Areas with more single parents have both kids in single-family homes and two-parent households do worse. So everybody does worse in the community when there are more single-parent households. It's really a community effect. Second, high mobility areas offer a great education to their children at all levels of schooling. And I think this aligns with a lot of recent research about how better education from higher quality teachers, smaller classrooms, and better funded colleges can have large effects on children's long-term outcomes. And the most recent research from the Equality of Opportunity Project points especially to the role of mid-tier colleges, so things like regional state universities, as important pathways to upward mobility, though in fact this too may be fading in recent years. So it's important to note that these factors describe high mobility areas, so they may not directly cause the differences in the rates of upward mobility. Changing them directly may not be exactly what we want to do, but I think these data do make it clear that in certain places, the American dream is alive and thriving, and our challenge is to make that dream available to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Fascinating testimony. We've had a host of folks come in after we got started, so what I thought I would do is, as Mr. Kudlow gets prepared, he came in very bravely on the plane and the car and everything else. I wanted to recognize a couple of my colleagues here for any brief comments they might have, starting with Mr. Mitchell from Michigan.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to hearing Mr. Kudlow's discussion. I would suggest that, I appreciate the testimony, I would suggest a big part of the problem we've got is reflected in my district. If you go back a chart, the 10th Congressional District in Michigan reflects the very limited mobility and the economic stagnation of the nation, both from manufacturing as well as what's happening in agriculture. A big part of that is unfortunately the result of why I ran for Congress, federal policy. We have educational crisis. And Ms. Milo, you talked about people going forward and going to the Ivy Tech and getting opportunity. The reality is we're waiting too long to educate our young people in terms of opportunity that exists in advanced manufacturing, to train them for that, to give that option to them until after they've graduated or theoretically graduated from high school. What that means is we've got a number of young people that we've tossed into the wasteland that are lost trying to figure out what to do when they finish school, if they finish school. In fact, by not showing those opportunities, many of them don't finish school because college isn't for them. What we created and started is the haves and have-nots, and we start that early on, in my opinion, in middle school, and we continue with that. I had 3 employers when I did my district discussions this last week, all raised the point that they can't find enough skilled personnel. And by skill, we're talking high-tech welders making significant money. People have worked long-term in employers. We're talking about people in advanced manufacturing, a high-tech plastic molding company that are just phenomenal jobs that they can't find people for in an area that economically is struggling. We have an educational crisis that starts in middle school. I'm fortunate to serve education workforce, and it's one of the things we're talking about addressing there because our policies have accelerated the gap. We stigmatized career education. We didn't provide career information as a nation, and now we're wondering why we can't find people to fill our jobs. So I appreciate your comments. I agree with them, and we'll do everything I can working with the committee and working with my colleagues to address that gap because it starts earlier than people when they finally get through high school. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Paul. Next, Mr. Allen from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's good to be here. I'm one of the hottest spots in the nation. In fact, I've never seen anything like it. This past Masters, they had billboards up advertising for drivers and vans and articles, and wanted ads in the news. A tremendous shortage, and they were trying to bring in people from all over the country and probably all over the world to fill that need. I've never seen that before, but I come from the business world and construction primarily, and we have got a major problem. We're going to need probably 250,000 workers in the next less than 10 years, and it's a real issue. It's an issue right now as well. Again, all the manufacturers I talk to, they could grow their business right now, but they just can't get the skilled workforce. So we have a serious issue in this nation, and the one thing that, Mayor, that they have told me is that, it's just hard to find people who can pass a drug test and will actually show up for work every day. And so I don't know how we deal with that, but that's the problem. And so we've got to address it. Thank you for being here. I'm excited to learn from this and hopefully be part of fixing this problem.
Thank you. And last but not least, before we turn to Mr. Kudlow, and I will have a brief introduction for Mr. Kudlow, though he probably doesn't need a very long one to this room, Mr. Poliquin from the great state of Maine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very grateful that you put the word great in front of the state of Maine, because it is. And Mr. Kudlow, I know you love that state. If you haven't booked your summer vacation, sir, we are ready for you. We need the business. Mr. Kudlow, I'm going to be at some point asking you a question, sir, and I just want to give you a heads up. It's going to be about border adjustability. We know in order to become competitive in this country, we need to make sure we solve this health insurance problem that's really truncating economic growth and opportunities for families. Also, our taxes are too high. How do we get this tax package done? What advice would you give us on that? Regulations, of course, and high energy costs. And then, Ms. Milo, I'm going to morph over you and specifically ask you a question about something we found in the 2nd District of Maine, which is, in my opinion, in many cases, not all, but in many cases, we made it too easy for able-bodied young adults to give them an option not to work or not to seek training, not to do community service. And from your position on the ground, I would love to hear your reaction to that and what you found. But with that, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate very much the opportunity to be here. I look forward to hearing from Mr. Pethokoukis and Mr. With the gentleman and everybody else. With the gentleman, yes, sir, I certainly will.
I appreciate the gentleman yielding. I would just like to also extend the invitation to Mr. Kudlow to vacation in what we call the hub of awesome, Cincinnati, Ohio. So,
reclaiming my time, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kudlow, I'll let you answer that when it's your time, but why in the world would you want to give up a lobster to go to Ohio? It does not make any sense to me, sir. Thank you, sir.
We got the best pizza, the best chili, the best ribs, the best ice cream in the nation in Cincinnati.
With all due respect to both the gentlemen, I think Mr. Kudlow has more important things he could be spending his 5 minutes on. But with that, I appreciate both of the comments, and I want to welcome to our panel CNBC senior contributor and a previous host of CNBC's Primetime, the Kudlow Report, a distinguished and knowledgeable leader in America's business world, Mr. Kudlow.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Sorry I'm late. Rainy day.
So it's a pleasure to be here. I hope I don't repeat what others have said. I love Cincinnati. I have a lot of friends there, including Rob Portman. I love Maine. I have a lot of friends there. But I live in rural Connecticut on the weekends. Anyway, thinking about this, I don't have a prepared testimony, but just some thoughts, Mr. Messer. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. So I've already heard some great things just in the last few minutes. This will come as no surprise, but my view for many years has been the most powerful solution to what ails us in general in the economic sphere, whether it's jobs, training, opportunities, rebuilding cities, schools. The number one issue is growth, economic growth. Growth solves a lot of problems. It may not solve every problem, but it certainly opens the door to solving every problem. And if we don't have growth, as we have not had in 15 or 16 some odd years, we're going to have more problems than usual. I mean, we're a big country, we're a great nation, I think there are a lot of opportunities. I appreciate what you said, but it's unequal. I agree, some people have been left behind. I'm not a redistributionist. I don't believe in spending a lot of time on inequality. What I do believe is, as John F. Kennedy, one of the heroes of my book, JFK and the Reagan Revolution, a rising tide lifts all boats. Now, we have more to do. It's a broader issue. But if you don't have a rising tide, you're not going to get it done. And as you mentioned, or someone mentioned, some of the rudiments of growth are pretty easy, pretty plain, in my opinion. We have to have limited government in every aspect. Low marginal tax rates to liberate our people for business and work and investment and risk-taking and creativity. Let's not inhibit them. Let's reward success, not punish it. Let's end the war on business that we've had for the last many years. You can't have a good job, a good wage, without a healthy business. And if you burden the business with taxes and regulations and whatnot, you're not going to have a healthy business. In which case, you're not going to have a good wage, whether it's in the West Belt or Maine or Ohio or any other place for that matter, New York City. So let's end the war on business. Let's reward success. That's the American way, in my opinion, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that includes a lot of regulations in the economic sphere, without question. I would be a free trader, make no bones about it. We may want to talk about some of those details and issues. I believe in sound money. I think if you want low tax rates and you want economic growth, you've got to have a stable dollar that people at home and abroad can rely on, and it keeps the inflation rate down. Inflation is a very cruel tax. And I also strongly believe in education reforms. I just heard some comments on this, very important. I'm a school choice person. I'm a charter school person. I'm active in my personal life in that sphere and my church life. And I believe it works best with parents running schools and give them as much freedom of choice as possible. I worry a lot about poverty. And many issues go with poverty. There's growth just right there, but I think education is part of it. I've heard that. I think as you go up the ladder, the kids aren't graduating with the skills they need, but even beyond that, things like community colleges and trade schools and tech schools, which will help matching the skills of the supply and demand of labor. I don't think we spend enough time on that, or some localities are. We have a deal up in Connecticut. I live in New York during the week, but I'm an active Connecticut resident and voter, and my diocese has a whole program of training kids, maybe right out of high school. Welders could make $125,000 a year or more, so can plumbers. That's pretty darn good. Someone's got to fix stuff. We've sort of lost the art or the cachet of fixing things, I got my kid who does my computer. When the computer goes down, I basically want to throw it out the window, but that would be wrong, and I can call my computer guy or girl, and she'll come in and fix it, and you can learn those skills. As I said, we have a Catholic diocesan program on that where we go to the local businesses and we say, what do you need? What do you need? And let's apply it. Come on our board, give us some money, and we'll rebuild the local community schools. It's a lost start. It's great to go to Yale, I guess. It's great to go to Wesleyan. We've got a lot of fancy schools in Connecticut. But when we're not putting books down, a lot of them don't come out with any learning. So we don't have to use all that stuff. Employment to population ratio is one of the key aspects that I use to gauge how we're doing in jobs. We have created a lot of jobs in the last bunch of years off a very bad recession, but a lot of people are being left behind. A lot of people have dropped out. I want to come back to that point in a second. But if this were truly a strong labor recovery, we would see a much higher employment to population ratio, particularly, this is one of my favorites, it's not just the older group, although I know people are retiring and baby boomers are retiring, and I'm a baby boomer, but in fact, if you look at their numbers, their work rates are rising, all right? And, you know, I have a bad back, but I'm still here, and I expect to go until I drop at my desk. What's really troublesome to me is that the prime age group, the 25 to 54, whatever it is, they're showing lower participation rates. And that's not good. That's the harder workforce. There are a lot of reasons for that, you know, maybe training reasons. Someone mentioned drug abuse. I think that's absolutely the case. I want to throw one in that, you know, completes, I want to be a Johnny One Note on growth and tax rates, but, you know, I think family breakup is a huge problem. And it's not just in the black inner cities, I think it's in a lot of white regions around the country. And I'm not going to give a lecture or a sermon, I'm just going to say that, you know, the importance of family cannot be underrated anytime, any place. And there's a whole, you know, literature on sociology about that that probably bears no repeating. So I will, you know, last point, I guess, just, you mentioned that, I think you said we're making it easy for people not to work. Was that the phrase? I don't want to put you out of context. This is a big issue with me, because we look at reforming Republican Party presumably as a free market reform party, it's a limited government party, and so forth and so on. We look at taxes, we're looking at health care as we must, we're looking at a lot of things, regulations. But let me just tell you, inside the budget, I mean, we did a lot, many years ago when I was one of Reagan's deputy budget directors, we looked at this, and it's going through cycles of better and worse. Right now, we're in a worse cycle. If you look at the small entitlements, it's not the big ones, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, Obamacare, and so forth. Look at the small entitlements, where the bipartisan welfare reforms of the mid-1990s have basically been completely undone. Time limits have been removed, work requirements have been removed, and we create a situation where it's actually cheaper or easier to not work than to work. And this is a long story. We've had, you know, policies like the Earned Income Tax Credit, and I understand that, but you have these big cliffs, these big fiscal cliffs, and Obamacare, by the way, is really important, unfortunately, has added to that problem enormously, and people can get along more than I'd like them to get along without working because of government assistance. And I'm a social safety net guy. I don't sound cruel and inhuman. Ronald Reagan was a social safety net guy. He instructed us very carefully. That's where I learned it. He was an old New Deal Democrat, and I'm an old Democrat myself. But the reality is we need to take a hard look at that. We want these people to be productive, and I think that helps their family life. I think it helps their kid raising. I think it helps in a million areas. But we really should create the right incentive structure so it pays to work after tax or after government subsidies, et cetera, et cetera. That's not a small thing, and I'm a little concerned. I haven't heard much of that in this Congress, and perhaps you'll get to it as you review a myriad of budget issues. So I'll just say, first, let's just grow the economy. I mean, we've grown, I did the work on this, Jimmy P. has heard me say this a million times on the air and so forth. Basically the post-World War II period, from round numbers, okay, from 1950 to 2000, the U.S. economy after inflation has grown at 3.4% at an annual rate. 3.4 for roughly a 60-year period. So don't tell me we have to be stuck at 1 to 2% growth, that is the new normal. I don't believe it. That's not our history. This is abnormal. And furthermore, just to have some fun, we looked at the whole 20th century. I've had other people look at this too, John Cochran of Stanford and so forth. And yeah, data being the data in the early part of the century, but we've basically grown about 3.5% per year post-inflation, including the Great Depression, in the entire 20th century. And I'll bet if we had any decent numbers, we would have done even better than that in the 19th century. So all I'm saying is, we don't have to accept subpar growth, and we should do everything we can to get out of that mess, and we'll get into healthcare and scorecard issues and reconciliation and all the rest of it. But, I'm a growth guy, and I'm a family guy, and kids need to get good schooling, and when they leave school, they should be able to get good training. Thanks.
I think the gentleman came in late, so we will forgive him. Our clock here tells us kind of what our time limits are, and so we're going to try to stay to those moving forward.
I'm very bad at it. I almost never missed a commercial break on TV.
It's great. I want to talk just real quickly about wages. And as Mr. Kudlow talked about, the left talks a lot about income inequality. And I can tell you, growing up as a working-class kid in Greensburg, Indiana, with a single-parent mom that worked at the factory, I wasn't worried about what the rich people in town were doing. What I was worried about is, would we have a chance? Right? Would we have a chance if we worked hard to build a life for ourselves? And I think what does matter is median wages. What's happening in the middle of our economy? Do people have an opportunity if they work hard to succeed? And economists now are saying that really real wage growth, the purchasing power of your dollar, is flatlined in the middle of this economy for 50 years. And yet, as Mr. Allen talked about earlier, you do talk to some employers who say, hey, I'd like to hire employees if I could get folks with the right training. So what do we do to drive wages? I know that's one of the great mysteries of the next century, but in this kind of, I'll start Mr. Kudlow and anybody else that might have thoughts.
Well, I'm not a labor expert, but I've done some work. I don't agree it's been the last 50 years. There's a lot of
economic numbers.
There's a lot of studies on this, from left of center and right of center. I do agree that since 2000, it's pretty unmistakable that real median wages have barely increased in whatever, 15, 16 years, barely increased. In fact, for a while, they were just flatlined. But I don't agree that that goes back to the 90s, 80s, 70s. I don't agree with any of that stuff. I'll leave it to others who have done more studies on that. So, how do we improve wages? Well, one basic thing is growth. I hate to sound like a Johnny One-Note, but the fact is, if the economy is literally not producing the goods and services, you're not going to produce the businesses that produce the work opportunities that produce the wages. So growth is very important. Now, in particular here, I have a strong interest. We've got to improve productivity and living standards. Output per hour actually has been flat for the last 4, 5, 6 years and barely moved since the year 2000. I don't have all those numbers in front of me, but barely moved. And in recent years, basically flat. That's unacceptable, so people are very unhappy. And we saw that in the last election. A lot of people are unhappy. Not just people in the steel industry, but a lot of people are unhappy. Services are, retail stores are going down, et cetera, et cetera. So, to me, the root of that particular problem with respect to productivity, living standards, we have to increase the growth of the total capital stock in America. Very important statistic. In the last 15, 16 years, it's grown about 1/3 of its entire post-war rate. And that, in turn, has cut down something called the capital over labor ratio, the K over L ratio, which is driving productivity. That has gone nowhere, virtually nowhere. So wages are the ultimate penalty. Low wages are the ultimate penalty because we're not investing. And again, I would argue, particularly our tax laws are pushing people offshore out of the country, or if they're in the country, they don't feel like embarking on 5, 7, 10-year type projects, whatever they may be, structures, technology, you name it. They don't want to do that because there has been a war on success, there has been a war on business. Our tax rates on business are way too high. When I was here as a Reagan deputy, the issue was individual tax rates, which were an enormous penalty, and that included small businesses. All right? I still think personal rates are too high, but I think the biggest problem we have is the business rates. And again, sort of a Kudlow 101, it's very fashionable to bash successful business people, rich corporations. We heard some of that in the last election. I'm just going to come back to this. You cannot have good jobs at good paying wages unless you have healthy businesses. My old mentor who got me into politics years ago, the late Congressman Jack Kemp, used to always say, trouble with Democrats, I don't want to even be partisan, but trouble a lot of people is they love jobs, they just don't like the people that create the jobs, okay? I don't want to be partisan because I don't think Republicans are perfect either, with the greatest respect. So I'm just saying, help business, large and small. Their time has come. And it goes directly, the analysis goes directly into capital stock and capital labor ratios and employment rates and ultimately towards, real median incomes or however you want to measure that.
I thank the gentleman. Next, we'll recognize the gentleman from Ohio for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all. I really enjoyed your commentary and learned a fair bit just from the testimony you provided, so it's an honor to be here and hear what you had to say. It occurs to me that one of the real challenges, if we look at the growth rate going forward and we do the things that we've talked about, the things that, with control of the House, the Senate, and the presidency, Republicans have a better vision for how we can move the country forward with respect to tax policy, with respect to the regulatory framework, with respect to trade policy, frankly. Lots of good reforms underway, but as you made reference to, I'm not sure the rest of the economy can actually keep up. Employers in Ohio, and as talking to my colleagues largely across the country, are struggling to find the workforce that lets them grow at 1.5%. So I'm anxious to hear your ideas on how we drive workforce participation. There's already wage pressure, inflation pressure, but we have switching opportunities with respect to imports. We've been able to have a strong dollar that lets us import readily. With respect to alternative products and just enough competition, whatever the drivers are, we're not getting the workforce participation that the wage inflation is driving participation. So just your ideas on what we can do, and I guess I'd start with the mayor. All government's local. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Davidson, for that question, and I think this touches on some of the thoughts and questions that we've heard from your fellow committee members. And from a perspective that I've heard shared by my fellow panelists here, I think first and foremost, recognizing the importance of family values and strengthening families to create that culture of encouraging work and recognizing the dignity that comes from being able to earn success. And encouraging that kind of a mentality is certainly something that we want to foster. Government's role in that, I think, still has there's a lot of question there. That I personally don't see that as necessarily government's role, but then you question, if nobody is doing that at home, then what happens to those kids that aren't receiving that aren't seeing a parent or a relative that has worked before? And so I think that speaks to a cultural component that still needs to be addressed, and where community can really serve in a valuable fashion. And some of the success stories that we've seen in LaPorte and other communities like LaPorte would be creating a connection for students to really be able to see what the expectations are in a work environment, to understand those cultural components of showing up to work on time and showing up to work regularly and showing up to work ready to work. That these are just not things that they've previously been exposed to. So the more that we can connect individuals with those opportunities, those learning chances to be able to know what those expectations are early on in the education process is critical. And then being able to connect individuals with specific pipelines and understanding some of those opportunities in a nimble fashion, I think, is a key component as we see rapid change happening in our communities and a larger level, to know what some of the in-demand types of occupations are and know what those careers look like and what the expectations are as far as training certifications leading up to that, and equipping current and future workers with that information is going to be a key element of encouraging the greater participation in the workforce. And there was a previous question about incentivizing non-work, and I think Mr. Cutler did a great job of talking about that there are some policies that make it financially unattractive not to participate, and we're then robbing those individuals of, then back to my earlier statement, the opportunity to receive the dignity of work. And we really need to evaluate those, that there are a number of people that I'll talk with that they say, you know, I'm receiving X amount of subsidies, but if I take on more work, then I stop receiving those subsidies. So from a financial standpoint, they have to continue in either a job that is underemployment for them, or they are just simply not seeking greater roles in their current employment because it would change their wage structure so that the job's not going to pay as much as they're earning in the incentives. And that's a key component that we need to address.
Thanks for highlighting that. I really appreciate what you spoke of earlier with second chance programs. In Ohio, it's about 20,000 people a year on average, just about 2 years, and they're just a great way to connect people back to the workforce. My time's expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, to the mayor, what was your thought about families and work? There's a connection, a huge connection. And we are all so politically incorrect. You know, two-parent family is a good thing, a very good thing. All right, now, I'm not going to pass judgment. There's a lot of situations around. But I'm just saying, if you had a choice, two-parent families breed the kind of discipline you're talking about. Having role examples to get up in the morning and go to work, that's huge. And low-ladder jobs lead to high-ladder jobs. We've lost that, too. And I don't know, maybe I'm some sort of antediluvian thinker, but I just think that's so important. Now, there's been good lately statistical, analysis on these problems, but don't lose that thought. Work is a virtue. Work is a spiritual, moral, and religious virtue. Okay? I'm supposed to be the big supply side guy in taxes, yeah, that too, but I'm just saying, work. Just can't beat it. Every time I speak at a bunch of college commencements, God help them, I just usually get up and yell at them for not working hard enough. I mean it. I said, you guys, you got your degrees or whatever, I want you to work hard. And then I want you to work even harder. And after that, I want you to break your back and work even harder. Honestly. It was only in recent years that I stopped working 6 days a week. I mean that. Only recent years that I've gone to a 5-day work. I'm sorry, I'll shut up.
No, I appreciate the gentleman's comment. As I mentioned earlier, I would just add this. I was raised in a single-parent family by my mom, and listen, there's a lot of hard work at single-parent families out there doing the best they can to make sure those values are communicated. But I'm also part of a two-parent family with my wife, and we work really hard to keep it that way.
Yeah, I'm not passing judgment.
So I think it's important to acknowledge both those things. But I think you're right. Listen, we all know the statistics. The two-parent family is a great anti-poverty machine, in addition to everything else, all the other important values that come.
Mothers and grandmothers can be very important.
Yeah.
I mean that.
Absolutely. Next up, the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It seems that obviously the two main issues here that we're talking about are jobs and then the workers that take those jobs. The success that the United States enjoyed early in the 20th century, I'd like to hear from Mr. Kudlow your take on the fact that back in those days, it seemed that the United States was the primary economy of the globe. I want to go a little global here, because I think it's more about what's going on around the globe now as opposed to just what's going on within the borders of the United States. And with emerging economies like China and others, how do you see that as impacting on our ability to grow at the rates that we were? And it leads me to the idea of the border adjustment tax and trying to bring some of that manufacturing and production back into the United States to create jobs for these workers. Can you comment on those issues?
Well, I can try. We weren't the only great economy at the turn of the last century. We had Germany, Britain, to some extent France, more Germany and Britain, very strong economies, but we passed them. We absolutely passed them. And we didn't even, the rest of the world didn't know we passed them until World War I came. Okay. And, in very general terms, sir, it's my favorite portion of history is the second half of the 19th century, we had extremely good policies for growth. Extremely good policies. I mean, we had no income tax, just for starters. We had tariffs, which sometimes got out of hand, but that was our only revenue source. But we didn't have the disincentive structure we have. The dollar was generally as good as gold, so people relied on the dollar. The dollar became the mainstay. It's not the only one, but we were U.S. and Britain, basically. So, opportunities to grow were vast, and the ability to use your God-given talent, creation was phenomenal. And we had one of the most inventive periods in history, right? I mean, the farms moved to the cities because of the industrial base. You have more, it's one of my favorite subjects. I mean, you go the first, 25 years of the 20th century, revolution after revolution, right? We forget. Cars, radios, TVs, airplane, I mean, I can go on. Passing railroads and stuff. And it's, we put buggy whip makers out of business. I regret that very much, but we also, Henry Ford employed millions of people, literally, and gave them good pay, right? The stories, you jack them up $5, and among other things, they go out and buy a Ford. And it was fabulous. That's why I don't fear gales of creative destruction. I don't feel the new replacing the old. I love that. That's fabulous. We need more of that, not less of that. China, are you worried about China? Let me just say, I can't help myself. I just want to give you my view and I'm prepared to argue this to death do us part, but right now, this idea of a border adjustable tax is one of the worst policy ideas I've ever seen. Okay? With due respect, and I know the leadership of this party, I've known them for years, and I love them, they're friends of mine, and they've done a lot for growth, but this is one bad idea. All right? I don't want an export economy. I don't want to stop imports. I don't want industrial policy. I want markets to drive business. All right? I don't want it. I don't want to be like Europe. I don't want to be like Asia. I don't want to heap new taxes. We're supposed to be, the Republican Party is supposed to be the low-tax party. Why are we inventing a new tax which will then grow? It is a brand new tax. Now, we can look at different tax options down the road. Consumption taxes and so forth, sales taxes. I get that. I'm not opposed to that. We have a good, robust discussion about that. I still wouldn't like border adjustment taxes, but this is not the time. This is just not the time. And I hope we get a follow-up on this. What initially appeared to drive this border adjustment tax was the absolute, totally wrong reason to ever make economic policy, and that is scorecards by a bunch of goofy models that aren't worth the paper they're printed on. And by the way, have no standing in law or rules with respect to reconciliation. You do not, if I can be blunt, you do not have to use the CBO. You do not. There is no rule or law. Just ask the woman who's the Senate parliamentarian and look at the history. All right, so I've got that off my chest. By the by, as an aside, We have sales taxes on imports. We get that? Almost every state in America has a sales tax, state and local. Let's not forget, and the biggest states that do the most trading have the highest sales taxes, 8, 9, 10%, including my state, including both my states, for Christ's sakes. Illinois, you look at the numbers. So we are taxing imports. Let me make that very clear. Mexico has a 16% VAT tax, which has lots of loopholes, by the way, but whatever. We have a sales tax. So that is a, flawed argument, unless you want us to go to 16 or 20. Our average national sales tax for states and localities is 6.5%.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that
That's
answer.
not a small thing. The rest of it, we can get on to China. Look, China, I'm not China's biggest fan either, all right? We have to live with them. But I think China, look, if you're going to break the laws, if you're going to steal our intellectual property rights, if you're going to counterfeit our goods, if you're going to hack your way into everything, government, private sector, we've got to do something about it. Absolutely. Handling that with tariffs is very risky. Trade wars are risky. I happen to think the president's playing his cards pretty good on this right now, frankly, with the currency manipulation decisions for a variety of reasons. But China's a problem.
Thank you very much. I'm well over my time, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rutherford. Next up, gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. First, let me reassure the panel that I agree about your concerns with what I would call welfare reform 2.0. In fact, I'm having conversations with the American Enterprise Institute about going back to that. We operated, before I came to Congress, back in the 90s, so the initial and largest welfare reform programs in the country. Welfare work in Detroit, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Savannah. Philadelphia is not the city of brotherly love, I can assure you of that. I haven't spent quality time there. Got called names there. We reach almost the equality of indivisible names, but that's a whole... Let me ask some feedback from Dr. Friedman. My background is economics and public policy. Tax policy now is, eventually going to hit the front burner here, maybe on Wednesday. What's your feedback for how it is that we restructure our tax code to encourage growth, which is key to our economy?
Thank you. So I think my sense is that there are two different problems with the current code, and I'm going to talk about this totally apart from whether we cut taxes or not, because I think the larger problems are how the code is structured, not how much revenue we raise, which then interacts with all sorts of other stuff. So I think that there are way too many carve-outs and loopholes in the code, and that does two things that are wrong. First of all, it creates incentives for people to switch up what they're doing in a way to take advantage of that, right? And sometimes that can just be a change on a piece of paper. Sometimes they can actually twist themselves around trying to change what they're doing, and I don't think that's good. And so I think you want a broader base for the taxes, and then that brings you to the second value, which is that once you have a broader base and you have fewer carve-outs, you can afford a lower tax rate to raise the same amount of money, which has all of the incentive properties for wages and growth that a number of other panelists have talked about. So the second thing, and I think here's where I respectfully disagree with my panelist, the key difference between the border adjustment tax and the various corporate reforms that have been proposed and what we currently have is that that tries to tax consumption, whereas our current system tries to tax profits. They're both getting at the same thing. A border adjustment tax would tax profits or consumption funded out of business profits or capital income. But the problem is that trying to tax profits is just too slippery. And what you end up with is an overcomplicated code with lots of loopholes and carve-outs, nevertheless, that increases compliance costs and still doesn't actually generate any revenue despite having very high rates. I think if you have a consumption tax, it's very easy in many cases to figure out where people are consuming things. People consume things in this country. We are a very large country. It's a much more robust tax base, and it's also something that, again, you can impose with a relative minimum of carve-outs, which allows you to simplify the tax and lower the rates.
Anybody else?
Jump in.
Sure, please.
Let's say we do a pretty good tax reform. We're not going for perfect, what we design on a blackboard. Let's say we go pretty good tax reform. And let's say that it increases potential growth rate of the U.S. economy. Let's say we're a 2% economy. Let's say that pushes us up, to a 2.5% economy. Does the fundamental reason we're having this hearing change? Are there still going to be left behind regions? Yes. Are those heat maps that we saw on that TV where we have dramatically different areas of mobility going to remain? Yes. I think growth is part of the answer. And I think tax reform is part of the answer for growth. But it's not going to be the whole answer. And I think just the work that Dr. Friedman has done on mobility, I think gets at some of the things we can do. Some of them are faster economic growth, but some of them are things like reducing segregation. Maybe the answer isn't always just lowering the top marginal tax rate. Maybe it's as simple as making sure people can get from where they live easily to where the jobs are in a region. Maybe the answer is just more school buses.
Let me stop you. Let me stop you a second. But when you start talking about government intervention to create more school buses, you're now trying to regulate or improving opportunity. Is it not simply about increasing opportunity across the spectrum? Is that not the best answer, rather than try to pick and choose how it is we create opportunity?
But I think if you're operating under a scenario where the rising tide lifts all boats,
It's a start.
which has been the history of the U.S. economy.
Sure.
But I think as someone like myself who believes in the power of markets, I at least have to look at what's going on and begin to at least look at the possibility that something is happening deep structurally within the U.S. economy where a rising tide might not lift all boats or might not necessarily lift them at a particularly fast rate. So it may not feel like they're rising. I think both globalization, I think more importantly, automation, maybe creating a situation where the rising tide isn't going to lift all boats, and you are looking at not picking winners and losers, but very simply, we talk about different pathways to the middle class. Perhaps we need, again, better apprenticeship programs where people can find non-college ways to the middle class, and maybe in that situation, apprentices don't have to pay a minimum wage, but people still need a living wage, so maybe you expand the earning
Aren't you suggesting
to help those people.
that the issue is not an issue whether they're jobs, but we aren't adequately addressing, in fact, the change in job opportunities that are there. We fail to prepare people for what are the new age of jobs, and they've been left without much opportunity, and many have given up. It's not an issue that they aren't there. I spent 10 days dealing with, I can't tell how many employers that can't find people from building trades to high-tech manufacturing, but we haven't prepared them. So I'm not sure that, and I appreciate the input, and this is the debate we're going to have over the next, Lord knows how long in Congress, so I do appreciate the input, and I as well am past my time, and I'm surprised the chairman hasn't smacked me yet, so I'll...
We're all for dialogue, so...
Yeah, but Jimmy, look, there's stuff here. Jimmy and I agree on a lot of stuff. We don't agree on everything, but, he's right in the sense that there are situations that need help, and that the rising tide doesn't necessarily deal with that, let's just say on a local, regional basis. And I agree with that. I mentioned trade and tech schools and community colleges, getting people to school on buses and so forth. I tend to view that as a local issue, as a, statewide local issue, but, I think that's there. I don't have a problem with that. I think the GOP doesn't have to be averse to any of that stuff. It's just how we do it and how we implement it, and of course what we spend on it. But again, I think the basic opportunity comes from growth.
Right. I just worry that, one, we view growth simplistically as a panacea, and I think if we're growing, I would love to see what those maps all look like if we're growing steadily at 3% rather than 2%. But I also don't think growth is a panacea for everything. I know you don't either, Larry. Nor do I think that taxes are the only thing that drives growth. I know you don't either. But I just worry that the focus on tax reform ends up consuming all the policy oxygen, and we end up not talking about things that aren't tax related. I certainly think tax reform is super important.
Without growth, what we're doing is we're fighting about who gets what piece of the pie.
But are there other ways to get growth other than
That's what we've done the last 8 years.
Well, I appreciate testimony. I want to turn to Mr. Pollock one, but let me just add this to give you an example. I was in Chicago with Aon Corporation, who is bringing apprentice programs to the insurance industry. They weren't doing carpenters and plumbers, which are, by the way, important apprentice programs as well, but, there was a time in this country where our land-grant university system was a radical new idea, right, that helped bring people to the marketplace of that time with the skills they needed to compete. And I think your thought that we need to think better about what we can do to make sure that when that tide comes, we have folks that even have a boat, that they can ride it, right? Because if they're not prepared in this modern economy with what the skills it takes to ride this tide, then it's not going to mean very much to them. And that's part of what I think this debate is about. What about Mr. Parkland from, I will say again, the great state of Maine?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Have an opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate the panel being here. I represent probably the hardest working, most honest folks you can find anywhere on this planet in Maine's 2nd District. It's not the strip, from Camden down to Kittery, but it's 80-85% of the rest of the state, west and central, northern and down east Maine. It's just great people. But we have and have had the last 30, 40 years, Jim, Mr. Pethokoukis, a tough period with high taxes, high regulations, trade that's been, in many cases, unfair, and a lot of our manufacturing base having left, whether it be paper or textiles or shoes or leather. So I know Mr. Cudlow mentioned a minute ago growth and the components of growth, and he mentioned, and I paraphrase, and Mr. Cudlow will correct me if I'm wrong, but you don't have higher take-home pay, you don't have more opportunities, you don't have better jobs unless you have investment. Investment gives you growth, that gives you jobs, gives you higher take-home pay. And what has not been mentioned in the tax reform package that we've been discussing here on the Hill is the expensing part. 100% of capital investments expensed in year one. So if you're in the landscape business, you want to buy a new chipper, you can expense the cost of that in year one. That's very pro-growth, very pro-family, very pro-jobs. So, Mr. Pethokoukis, well, if you comment on that and let us know if we're on the right track, sir. And then we'll move on to Mayor Milo after.
Yeah, listen, I think this sort of immediate expensing it would be a valuable change in the tax code. I think you could find broad agreement on that. The only concern among some people would be the impact on the budget, which is one reason, obviously, as Larry said, that they start talking about border adjustments. So I am concerned about debt deficits, but I think as a fundamental change to the tax code, that is absolutely the right direction.
Good. Mayor, thank you, Mr. Pethokoukis. Mayor Milo, please. Even though we're in a district where the wages tend to be lower than other parts of New England, in other parts of the country, we have a very strong feeling among the 650,000 wonderful people that I represent, that folks that are able to work, and I know we've talked about this a little bit, but are not incentivized to work, are not only cheating those who really need the help and are disabled and elderly, sick, and what have you, and those that desperately need help. But it's also goes beyond that. I want to tell you what I found, and tell me if you agree with that in Indiana, I know we're in Maine, is that in some of our public assistance programs, which are very important safety nets, we have right now at both the federal and the state level, some are federal, some are state, that if you receive, for example, SNAP benefits, food stamp benefits, if you are involved in an act of terrorism on U.S. soil, once you leave your jail sentence, you can still qualify for SNAP benefits. And if you game the system, or you've been convicted, Mayor Milo, convicted of a drug offense and you serve time, when you get out, you still qualify for welfare benefits. I don't think that's right. I also think the path that we're going on now, which we've talked about a little bit, is give folks an incentive to become independent of government programs, because I have a 26-year-old son that I'm very close to, raised as a single dad. I did not raise Sammy to become dependent on the government. So we want to give folks incentives to work. My mother, who is now 89, and God bless her, over the last couple of years, she's had help, and we had a problem getting folks to come in to help her because say, I'm sorry, Bruce, I can't take this job because I'm going to make too much money and I'm going to lose my Medicaid benefits. Now, that's absolutely wrong for that person who wants to grow into a higher paying job and to help my mom as an example. So do you find this whole thing about welfare reform, dealing specifically with work, drug offenses, terrorist acts, things like that, makes sense to you as a mayor?
I would say that on the whole, when I listen to the commentary, it makes me think of a phrase that was a leadership phrase passed down to me from the first captain I served under on the USS Mason, that he would always tell us, err on the side of the sailor. And that as we're trying to figure out ways that we're trying to serve others and to serve those of which we have a constituency toward, then are there going to be those who potentially are not going to have the right incentives or the right mindset to take advantage of programs that we're wanting to put together? Probably. But on the whole, I really truly believe from what I'm talking to people in the portal, whether I was to visit Maine and talk to any of the great folks that were there, that there is a genuine desire to work and to earn the right formula to ensure that we're moving that forward. With the specifics with, committing acts of terrorism and if individuals have been incarcerated for various offenses, I can't speak to whether those are the right stipulations to try and apply to this, but the other piece I think to include in this discussion is to understand that the people affected most, particularly with SNAP benefits, are children. And so how are you affecting the children that are then, they just are having to respond to the consequences of their parents' decisions. And so how are we best serving individuals, to go back to your original statement and your original thoughts of encouraging that people who are receiving any of these benefits are participating in the workforce and then therefore able to appreciate and feel the dignity and the value and I think the excitement that comes from knowing that you've earned that success and where are those measures. I think that that's applicable across your district, across Indiana and many other states.
Thank you very much, Mayor. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired, and Ms. Mayor, thank you very much for your service to our country.
Thank you. I'm going to take Chairman's liberty here and ask one more question. And I want to focus, I really appreciate the testimony of the panel. Dr. Friedman, I was fascinated by your original testimony on social mobility, and after all that, it really is the essence of what we think of when we talk about the American dream, that if you work hard, you can build better opportunity in your life. Sort of two-part question. One, you mentioned some of this research about how that's changed in America, and could you compare that a little, because another part of the American dream is that America is the best place to find that opportunity. How are we comparing now to other nations? And then it seemed in your testimony you stopped just short, and Mr. Pethokoukis mentioned a little some of the things that we might be able to do to enhance social mobility, but any thoughts you have on how we can better enhance social mobility from a policy perspective?
Thank you. So we, as a nation, have relatively less mobility, unfortunately, on average at least, than many other countries in the developed world. So, for instance, that statistic that I gave you about the probability that a child born to a poor family rises into the top fifth of the income distribution themselves, that's about 7-8% in the U.S., and it's about 13-14% in Canada. It's also higher in the UK and in Denmark, among other places. Now, I think that the reason why our work has focused on the variation across the U.S. is that to say that things work differently in Denmark, maybe lots of things are different in Denmark, and, kids can move up in the income distribution, but it's a much more compressed income distribution for all sorts of other reasons, very high marginal tax rates in Denmark, so it's not obvious that that's a place where we can look to learn a tremendous amount. But what we see is that the variation in the U.S. is larger than the variation across countries. And so we don't need to go to Denmark or to Canada. We can just go to places right in the U.S. and see the fruits of successful places of opportunity. Now, in terms of concrete policies to improve opportunity, in my mind, I think there's no more important policy than education. And I think this could be offered as the answer to a number of questions that you and the panelists have asked today about improving wages, about improving workforce participation. I think it's also a clear area where government intervention is sometimes required, both because, at the high school and elementary level, right, it can be a local problem, but that's still a government provision. And at the college level, I think that sometimes 18-year-olds don't make the right decisions, and to kind of put their entire future on something you decide at 18, those folks need a little bit of help. And I think that's an important role of parents, but in many cases, they're not getting that help, or especially I think of a first-generation kid coming to college for the first time from anyone in their family, like they might just not have the experience and the answers. And so I think that in education across the entire spectrum, we have clear evidence of what works. So for instance, the difference between a single year of a classroom with a top-notch teacher as opposed to an average teacher, that's going to increase the future wages of the kids in that class together by $1.5 million. I didn't misspeak there. It's $1.5 million. It's an incredible amount of return. Even if you discount it back to all the time when the kids are in 6th grade, it's still about $250,000 a year for the value of a better teacher. It seems that education matters at all ages. It's not simply the case that it only matters when you're really young or another, but just every single year of better education matters. And for college, I think it matters not just whether you go to college, but where you go and what you do. As our economy changes, as we respond to changing technology, to our interaction in the world, where our place for manufacturing in the world economy is now different than it was a generation ago, we need new skills for a new age, and we need to make sure that the schools that are providing this, especially those schools that largely survive on government dollars, are providing a good return on the students who go there.
Wow, thank you. Very distinguished panel. As you heard today's discussion, I'm reminded of what you find anytime you're trying to address a big, hard challenge, and that's that sometimes the solutions are simple to articulate, but then hard to execute, right? And I think as all the panelists, Mr. Kudlow first among, but then the others, you all mentioned, growth is a big part of this, right? It's very hard to see real wage growth unless you have real competition for employees. But I also think there's more to it than just the traditional Republican answers of course we need to reduce the regulatory burden. We need a tax code that has the right kinds of incentives. We need to rethink whether the big institutional structures of the 21st century meet the demands of the workforce in the 21st century. And I alluded to it earlier, but I had an opportunity to go to Aon, and they brought in a room of folks, all of them young, minority, urban, mid-20s, folks who had at one time or another dropped out of school and were now back in an apprentice program on a path towards success. And I think we need to ask ourselves, does our modern structure of training in this workforce work in an economy where someone may change jobs 6, 7, 8, 10 times in their life? Or for folks who made some mistakes early in the process, I mentioned my background, but my mom basically made me behave in school, and eventually I had the right kinds of grades and went to the right place. But if that's not where you were when you were 14 or 17 or 21, how do we get you back in with a second chance, as some have alluded to before? But as the great mayor from the city of LaPorte mentioned to me, in every challenge is an opportunity. And man, there's nothing wrong with America that can't be fixed by all the things that have been right for a really long time. Thank you for your opportunity and your willingness to be here today. Take care.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you very much. John Friedman.
John, Larry Kudlow.
Nice to meet you.
Where are you from, John?
My family's from Louisville, Kentucky, but I grew up in Boston, and I teach at Brown University.
So are you from
I am.
It's a pretty crazy place.